The door came off its top hinge when Tom Kestler hit it with his shoulder, and he was already shouting before I had both boots laced. "She's dying, Hannah. God in heaven, she's dying. You've got to come now."
Now!
I was off my porch and onto my horse before he finished the sentence, my satchel already in hand from where I keep it loaded and waiting by the door every single night of my life. Because a midwife who has to stop and think before she runs is a midwife nobody should trust with anything. The storm hit us both like a wall the moment we cleared my barn. Snow coming sideways on a wind that screamed down off the peaks. The kind of Colorado blizzard that kills careless men by the half mile. Tom's horse went down hard on the ice at the creek crossing, and he came up cursing and bleeding from a split lip and back in the saddle before I could even call out, because some things matter more than a little blood. And his wife screaming in a cabin 3 miles off was one of them. We rode the last stretch at a dead run through black timber that could have taken an eye out in the dark, branches cracking past my face, snow filling my collar, and I heard Sarah Kestler before I ever saw the cabin lights. A sound no woman makes unless something has already gone badly wrong, high and tearing and going on far too long without a breath between. I want you to understand something before I tell you anything else, before I tell you who I was, or what I'd been carrying for 17 years, or how a stranger named Elias Rourke had ridden into my life only 3 weeks earlier and changed the shape of everything without either of us intending it. You should know how this story actually starts. It starts with me on my knees on a plank floor with blood soaking through my skirt, both hands inside a laboring woman's body, feeling a baby turned the wrong way, and a young mother's strength running out like water through my fingers while the wind tried to tear the roof off the world. Everything else comes after. This is where it starts, but to understand why my hands went cold in that cabin, you need to know what I was carrying into it. I had delivered 43 children in Larkspur, Colorado by that November, and not one soul in that town knew I had once let a baby die. Larkspur was a small place then, maybe 200 souls scattered where the plains gave way to the first hard rise of the Rockies. A church, a mercantile, a livery, and no doctor at all. Hadn't had one in 4 years. Most frontier towns in 1884 went years, sometimes a full decade, without a trained physician, and people made do the way people always make do out here, with midwives and home remedies and a willingness to be useful. I was that steady hand, had been since I was 17, since a midwife named Ruth took me on and taught me to turn a breech baby with my fingers and stop a hemorrhage with pressure and prayer. Both applied firmly. I charged $4 a delivery when a family could pay it, eggs or cloth when they couldn't. And I built a reputation in that county, one careful birth at a time, brick by brick, the way you build something you need badly to last. What nobody in Larkspur knew was that the foundation under all that competence had a crack running clean through it, and the crack had a name. She would have been 17 that autumn. Same age I'd been the night I lost her. Elias Rourke stepped off the Denver stage on a Tuesday 3 weeks before that storm, and I will admit plainly that half the unmarried women in Larkspur developed sudden, mysterious ailments requiring a physician's attention within the week. He was the kind of handsome that made a room go quiet without meaning to. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark auburn hair touched with grey at the temples, a jaw you could have set a level against, and eyes so intent when they landed on you that you understood immediately why his patients trusted him with their lives. He'd trained in Philadelphia, practiced there over a decade, and came west for reasons he didn't offer and I didn't ask after, because you learn fast in a frontier town that everyone is running from something and the decent thing is to let them arrive unquestioned. I met him properly on his 3rd day when Mrs. Abernathy's boy fell off the mercantile roof and broke his arm, and I happened to be nearest. Dr. Rourke set the bone with hands so precise and unhurried the boy barely cried, and when he finished he looked at me, really looked the way very few people ever manage, and said he understood I was the midwife. "I am," I told him. "Then we'll see a good deal of each other," he said. "I've found a town's doctor and its midwife either work together or against each other, and there's rarely an in-between. I told him I hoped for the former and did not tell him I'd already decided in the space of that one conversation to keep him at exactly the distance I kept everyone. Close enough to be useful, far enough to be safe. It did not stay that distance long. Over the weeks that followed, Dr. Rourke and I found ourselves crossing paths more often than the town's medical needs strictly required, and Larkspur, being Larkspur, noticed everything and said most of it out loud. Mrs. Abernathy took to timing his visits past the mercantile with the precision of a woman keeping her own private ledger. "That new doctor walks the long way to the feed store just to pass your porch, Hannah Voss," she told me one Saturday, "and don't tell me you haven't noticed, because I've noticed, and I notice considerably less than you do." I told her I hadn't the faintest idea what she meant, which was a lie so plain she laughed outright and bought her flour and left me standing there with my face gone warm despite the October chill. I checked on Sarah Kessler twice that month as her time drew closer, and each visit Elias happened to be riding toward the Kessler place on some errand of his own that always seemed almost exactly to align with mine. We rode the last stretch together both times, talking of nothing in particular, the weather, a difficult case from his years in Denver, whether the Kesslers well ran sweet or bitter, and I found myself, against every careful instinct I'd spent 17 years building, looking forward to those rides more than I had any right to. Sarah Kessler was 22 and expecting her first child that same month, and when her labor started early on a Thursday night in the season's first hard snow, I had no way of knowing I was about to be back on my knees in a cabin identical in every way that mattered to the one that had broken me apart 17 years before. The baby was breech, and not a clean breech I could manage with the turning technique Ruth had taught me. Sarah had been laboring 6 hours already, and her strength was failing fast, and somewhere beneath my own steady hands I felt the old cold understanding rise up in me. The exact understanding I'd felt only once before, at 17, in a storm just like this one. I sent Tom back out into the blizzard for Dr. Rourke, and prayed, for the first time in years, that prayer might actually count for something. He arrived within the half hour, coat white with snow, breathing hard, and he did not hesitate. He was beside me instantly, hands already moving, asking questions in a low, steady voice that cut through the room's panic like a keel through water. Tom Kessler stood pressed against the far wall, fists white-knuckled, unable to do anything but watch and pray, and the wind kept slamming the shutters against the cabin's outer wall like something trying to get in. Sarah's screams had gone hoarse by then, worn down to a raw animal sound that filled every corner of that small room, and beneath it I could hear my own heartbeat pounding louder than seemed possible. We worked together nearly 2 hours, and I will say plainly I have never in my life seen hands like his, moving with the same unhurried precision he'd used on a broken arm, except now the stakes were a young woman's life and a child who hadn't yet drawn breath. He talked to Sarah the whole time in that low, even voice, telling her exactly what he needed from her and exactly what would happen next, and I watched her fix her eyes on his face like a woman holding onto a rope over open water. Near the worst of it, Sarah began to hemorrhage, and the room went the particular kind of quiet that means everyone understands exactly how close the edge is. My hands started to shake. In 17 years of births, my hands had never once shaken, and I understood, with a clarity more frightening than the blood, that I wasn't looking at Sarah Kessler's face anymore. I was looking at another face, 17 years gone, in another storm just like this one, watching my own young hands fail at the one thing they'd been trained to do. Elias's hand closed over mine. Not gentle, not romantic, firm, the way you'd steady a rifle. "Hannah," he said, "look at me, not her, me." I looked at him. "You know what to do," he said. "You've done it before. Do it now." I did it. The baby came, a breathing girl, minutes later, small and furious and entirely alive, and Sarah wept and held her daughter Ruth against her chest while the storm beat the windows, and I stood back against the wall with blood on my hands and my whole body shaking in a way it hadn't in 17 years. He found me afterward on the frozen porch step where I'd gone because I couldn't make myself stand in the joy inside. Joy I didn't feel I'd earned the right to share. He sat beside me without asking, which I noted was exactly right, because if he'd asked, I would have told him to leave. "We did well tonight," he said. I didn't answer. "Hannah," he said, quieter. "What did you see in there?" "It was not Sarah you were looking at for a moment." "I've seen that look before. I've worn it myself." I meant to tell him it was nothing, the lie I'd perfected over 17 years. But something about the cold, and the blood drying on my hands, and the way he'd said, "Look at me," not her, as though he already knew there was a her. Something made the lie stick in my throat and refuse to come. "I was 17, I said, apprenticed to a midwife named Ruth. There was a breech birth in a storm much like tonight, and Ruth was 3 miles off delivering another child, and I was alone with a girl not much older than myself, having her first baby. I did everything I'd been taught, and the baby did not live. Her name would have been Eliza," I said. "I chose it because her mother was too far gone by morning to choose it herself, and somebody needed to. I've delivered 43 children since that night, built this whole life on being the woman who never lets it happen again. And every time, some part of me is still standing in that cabin at 17, watching my own hands fail." I told him about the weeks afterward, too, how Ruth had held me while I sobbed and told me, not unkindly, that grief and guilt were 2 different animals and I'd need to learn to tell them apart or they'd both eat me alive. I told him how I'd nearly given up midwifery altogether that winter, how I'd sat in my father's kitchen for 3 days, deciding whether I had any right to touch another laboring woman as long as I lived, and how in the end I'd gone back not because I'd forgiven myself, but because somebody had to do the work, and I was the only one in that county who knew how. I told him I had said yes to every hard birth since, every breach, every hemorrhage nobody else wanted to touch, because some cracked open part of me believed that if I did enough of them right, it might someday balance the one I'd done wrong. I had never said any of it aloud before, not in that order, not with that much honesty, and saying it now felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized had grown heavier. Every year I carried it alone. He didn't tell me it wasn't my fault, which I'd have hated. He was quiet a long moment, looking at the snow. "In Philadelphia," he said finally, "I had a patient, a woman named Constance Whitfield, 30, her 3rd child. I misjudged a hemorrhage, certain of my own skill in a way that left no room for being wrong, and by the time I understood how wrong I was, it was too late. She died on my table with her husband in the next room. I left my practice 4 months later and told everyone I wanted a change of scenery. What I meant was I couldn't stand in that city another day knowing what I knew about myself." He looked at me directly. "So you'll understand, I'm not offering comfort I haven't earned the right to offer. I'm telling you what I know from the inside of the exact same room." I looked at this man, snow-dusted and steady, handsomer in that raw, unguarded moment than he had any right to be, who had just handed me the one thing I'd never received in 17 years of silence. Not forgiveness, but company. "I don't know what to do with that," I told him honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," he said. "Just know it's there." We sat until the sky grayed toward morning, and something shifted between us that neither of us tried to name yet, because naming it felt like it would break under the weight too soon. The months that followed moved the way frontier courtships move, slow and built from small, true things. He walked me home after difficult births. I brought him coffee when he worked late over his ledgers. We spoke of Eliza and Constance Whitfield openly now, the way you speak of old wounds once someone agrees to hold one edge of the bandage while you tend the other. And the stone in my boot grew lighter with every conversation, not because what happened had changed, but because I no longer carried it entirely alone. Elias asked to court me properly that spring on the same porch step. "I have watched you work for 6 months," he said, "and I've never seen a woman more certain of her own hands, and I would like to be the man who reminds you of that on the nights you forget it yourself." I told him I would like that very much. Mrs. Abernathy, who had never once let a piece of gossip in Larkspur go unclaimed, told anyone who would listen that she'd known it since the morning of her boy's broken arm, and took no small satisfaction in being right. Sarah Kestler, holding little Ruth against her shoulder, cried at the news in the particular way of a woman who understood exactly what had passed between us on that porch step, though I'd never told her the whole of it. Tom shook Elias's hand and told him gruffly that he'd owed the man a debt since that November night that he doubted he'd ever finish repaying, and Elias told him the debt had already been settled the moment Ruth Kestler drew her first breath. We married the following autumn, a year almost to the week since the Kestler birth, in the same small church I'd sat through 17 years of Sundays without once telling a soul what I carried. I wore my mother's ivory dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the sleeves, and Elias stood at the front in his good black coat, looking, I will say without embarrassment, like the handsomest man Larkspur had ever seen married inside those walls, and when I walked toward him I understood with the full weight of 17 years that some griefs don't end. They simply learn to make room for something new growing up alongside them. There's a grave on the ridge above town, unmarked, but for a small stone I placed there myself, with nothing carved on it but a single name. I visit it still, every year, and I no longer go alone. Elias walks up with me and stands quietly at the edge of the plot while I say what I need to say to a girl who has been gone longer than I care to count. I never told anyone else in Larkspur about Eliza. I didn't need to. I'd told the one person who mattered, and he had not looked away. He carries a ledger page folded soft in his coat pocket with a name written on it that isn't mine, and he's never asked me to explain the stone on the ridge, and I've never asked him to explain the page. Some griefs don't need explaining between two people who already understand exactly what they're looking at.